Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Capital Edge Tip Line. I'm Chad Braley, the CEO at Capital Edge, and excited to be back with you all this week. So today's session is going to kind of focus on the Contractor Purchasing System review, and specifically some updates that we've seen as part of the revolutionary FAR Overhaul, FAR 2.0, if you will, and some of the model deviation text. We'll talk about a couple of the inflationary threshold changes and just kind of what we're seeing in the CPSR. Now, we could probably do this for 3 hours, but I'm going to try to fast track this a little bit and really give you guys the highlights. So as of February 2026, the DoD/Department of War has adopted the model deviation text from the revolutionary FAR overhaul. But again, that didn't happen until just now. So from a FAR Part 2 perspective, right, we've really seen the definitions as it relates to commercial products and commercial services unchanged. The commercial off the shelf remains unchanged. Obviously, we have the micro purchase threshold and the simplified acquisition threshold that both increased as of October 1st of last year, and we'll get to that a little bit. And things like price analysis, pretty much unchanged from a FAR 15 perspective. Letter contract requirements in FAR Part 16, pretty much unchanged. Now, when we get to FAR Part 44, right, we do have some changes. And again, I'm not going to go through every single one of them, but kind of give you the cliff notes and highlights. One, the approved purchasing system definition in Part 44.001 has been removed, right? It is defined in the 244-2 clause from a purchasing system perspective, but it's out of the FAR. And then we've seen a lot of things like, consent to subcontract, significantly condensed. One of the things that has been interesting, if you think about, advance notice and consent, if you think about approval or withholding approval as it relates to FAR 44.3, a lot of things have been discarded, but interestingly enough, they're not actually showing up in the FAR companion guides, which we kind of would have expected them to, because in other sections where things have been removed, a lot of that has transitioned to a FAR companion guide. So another thing from 44, from a definition perspective, right, it's been added to include a definition of subcontract, which also includes intercompany transfers, which previously referred to FAR Part 12 for that definition. So that's something that, I think just to be cognizant of. When we think about eligibility, one thing that was interesting is we kind of had this, everybody's always talking about this $25 million kind of milestone kind of target, right? It didn't mean that, you had to have that to have a CPSR, but that was kind of the baseline threshold. Obviously, the DFAR's deviation for that is at 50 million. DFAR's 244 remains intact. However, the 25 million forecasted milestone has been struck out of this section from an eligibility perspective. So it really is now relying on the contracting officer to determine if a CPSR is needed, right, based on volume, complexity, dollar value of subcontracts. The other thing that was kind of interesting, which we haven't seen in practice, but there's no more mention of sales volume, including qualifying and non-qualifying sales. So that definition has changed. However, we've not seen any actual changes, from a CPSR perspective. But granted, right, this was just accepted. The deviation text was just accepted by the Department of Defense/Department of War, effective in February of this year. So, it's going to be interesting kind of to see how that plays out. From an experience standpoint, right, have we seen movement away from ACOs, DACOs, CACOs determining the need and coordinating directly with the CPSR group for, performing and conducting CPSRs? No, we haven't. Have we seen them discard qualifying versus non-qualifying sales methodology for the CPSR need determination and the development of the PO universe? No, haven't seen anything from that standpoint. Haven't seen them discard the definition of sales as it was previously used, which is now obviously changed. So not a lot necessarily changing yet, but I think, in terms of where things are headed, right, it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. Now, we have a couple of CPSRs coming up here shortly, so we may be I may be back to update you on those. Micro purchase threshold right now up to 15,000, and of course 25,000 if you're supporting contingency ops, 40,000 for excuse me, acquisition to facilitate defense against certain attacks. Simplified acquisition threshold, 350,000, right? $1 million for contingency ops and $2 million to facilitate defense against certain attacks. So just a couple of those changes, but that kind of flows through, right? And in terms of your CPSR and how you're contracting and the different levels of requirements, whether you're micro purchase, whether you're SAT, whether you're above that. So just some things to keep in mind. In terms of deficiencies, right, I would say that we are still running from a commonality perspective, right, the same most common deficiencies. I think as the reviews continue and some of these changes come out, it'll be interesting to see if they change kind of the extent of the review and some of their different focus areas. But as of now, right, it's price and cost analysis or lack thereof, right, being a huge issue. Source selection justification, right, FAFATA, debarment, DPAS, payments to influence, commerciality determinations, right? And we've heard nothing from the administration except more commercial, more commercial, more commercial. And part of the rewrite also says you shouldn't be putting additional terms in a commercial item contract. And so that's going to be, I think, a challenge for a lot of companies who say, well, I'm going to issue this commercial, but I'm going to still load up all these unnecessary terms and conditions, right? And go through the old, well, if it doesn't apply, it'll read itself out, which is always a challenge and becomes expensive when we're trying to read things out later that become issues. Negotiations, documentation of negotiations, obviously Truth in Negotiations Act and certified cost and pricing data, and then just deficiencies from a policy and procedure standpoint that aren't addressing, right, all of the regulatory requirements. So those are really the 9 big, kind of most common areas of deficiency. And so, keep that in mind as you're being notified, as you're prepping for the CPSRs, because that is the one business system that I would say is on the really the standard cadence for contractors. And with acquisition, especially with what's going on in the world ramping up, we expect to see certainly continued oversight from that perspective. So that's just some of the highlights there to talk about. I hope this has been helpful. Obviously would love to have feedback, questions. If you have detailed questions, feel free to direct message me. Be happy to get you in touch with the right people to address those. And until next time, we'll see you then. Thank you.